So in this talk, I will start by presenting the view that I will be arguing against throughout the presentation. And I think it's maybe best articulated or more poignantly laid out by Jason Brennan in his book, The Ethics of Voting, when he wrote that human beings are really differential to authority, that they cower before uniform opinion, that they are swayed not so much by reason, but by a desire to belong, by emotional appeal, and by sex appeal. And relatedly, many of you will be familiar with this quote by Voltaire and really his translator, who changed it quite a bit. Whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. So in both of these quotes, the idea is that essentially people are very easy to persuade, even en masse. So it's possible to manage to get a lot of people very quickly to change their minds. That would be because people are quite bad at figuring out whom they should trust and what they should believe. And that once people get the wrong idea in their mind, this can have really dramatic consequences. They end up doing things that are very costly for themselves and for society. And I will argue against all of this. I will try to make the case that this is mostly misguided. And I will start with the first point, which is that people are easy to persuade, even en masse. And to do this, I will look at three examples of three attempts at mass persuasion. So three attempts at really getting a lot of people to change their minds pretty quickly through propaganda and political campaigns and advertising. And when it comes to propaganda, I will only take one example, the most infamous and also the best study, the example of Nazi propaganda in Germany. And as you can imagine, many scholars, historians and others have looked at the content of Nazi propaganda, the newspapers, the radio programs, the movies. But actually, I think that Ian Kershaw was the first historian to really ask the question, did it work? Like, was this this barrage of propaganda efficient in shaping the minds of Germans at the time? And so to do this, he consulted a wide variety of archival material, including, crucially, reports from what would be the equivalent of Gallup for Nazi Germany. So the organization within the Nazi Party, whose task was to try to figure out what German people were thinking, so that they could avoid, they would anticipate a coup or a revolt of the public. And so these are Nazi operatives trying to describe how efficient the propaganda was. And based on that, on a variety of other materials, Kershaw concluded that Nazi propaganda had largely failed, except when it could build on existing consensus, confirm existing values, and bolster existing prejudices. So essentially, whenever the Nazi propaganda wanted to change people's minds, so for instance, when they wanted to justify the euthanasia of handicapped people, it completely fell flat. And it's only when it could play on existing prejudices, like, unfortunately, anti-Semitism, which was very widespread in Germany and in Europe more generally at the time, that they could have success. But success mostly in the sense that people did not reject the propaganda. They agreed to it, but it's not clear that they'd really changed people's minds, given that people were already anti-Semitic. And more recently, there has been a number of quantitative studies that have attempted to test, maybe more thoroughly, Kershaw's conclusion. I think my favorite of these studies is a study by Maya Adena and her colleagues, who have looked at whether being the main medium of propaganda at the time was radio. It was by far the most important, and the radio towers pre-existed the Nazi regime. And so you can use proximity to a radio tower as some exogenous variable. So if you're close to a radio tower, you're going to be exposed to much more Nazi propaganda. If you're further away from a radio tower, you're going to be exposed to much less Nazi propaganda. And then it's possible to see whether people who were closer to radio towers were more affected by the propaganda, and in particular, whether they would be engaging in more anti-Semitic acts. And so what that paper showed is that on the whole, Nazi radio propaganda seemed to have sometimes boosted anti-Semitic acts, but only in areas that were already highly anti-Semitic. And if anything, it might have backfired in other areas. So what that suggests really is that German people were enabled, propaganda enabled them to act on the basis of pre-existing anti-Semitic prejudices and feelings, but it did not really create these prejudices in the first place. And this is kind of confirmed in one of I was talking about this branch of the Nazi Party that was looking into the public opinion of Germans, and one of their reports to the Nazis higher up read, "Our propaganda encounters rejection everywhere among the population because it is regarded as wrong and lying." So the Nazis themselves recognized that their propaganda was largely inefficient. The second example I will move to is that of political campaigns, and I will mostly take the example of political campaigns in the US, because that is by far where the most money is spent, and that is also by far the country in which we have the most data and the most studies to look at. So as many of you will know, political campaigns in the US in particular can take many different forms, from robocalling or canvassing or TV ads, online ads, flyers, many different things. And for about 20 years now, political scientists have tried to figure out whether individual campaign acts, so kind of one round of canvassing, an extra buyout of advertising, etc., has an effect on voters. And to do that, in partnerships with campaigns, they have conducted randomized controlled trials on political campaigns. So you take, for instance, a state or a city, like I think this is Philadelphia, and it is divided in electoral districts, and you can know the results of each electoral district, like how many people voted for which candidate in each of these districts. And so what you do then is in half of the districts at random, you're going to do an extra round of canvassing or an extra round of robocalling, you're going to, or in half of or in any other half you do nothing, or in half of the state TV markets, you will play more advertising or different advertising than in the other. And then you simply measure whether voting behavior has been influenced by this extra campaign act. And so the best paper we have on this is a paper from a few years ago now by Josh Callan and Dave Brookman, in which they did a systematic meta-analysis of the 40 then existing field experiments following the design of a randomized controlled trial, to which they added 9 experiments of their own. And their conclusion is that the best estimate of the effects of campaign contact and advertising on Americans' candidates' choices in general elections. So that's a mouthful to say, if you look at big ticket elections like presidential elections or gubernatorial elections, and if you look at the effect of one extra campaign act, the average effect of that extra act is 0. So at least that gives you kind of, a bound in the sense that the effects are going to be very weak, because if you look at the best available data, it's really hard to distinguish from 0. On the whole, the conclusions from the political science literature are that there are essentially no effects of political campaigns in major elections shortly before election day. And so major elections is important because in these major elections, most voters already have set their minds. They have made up their mind because they have read newspapers, they have watched TV, so they know enough about the candidates such that the information provided by the campaign is mostly redundant. By contrast, if you look at elections for which people have weaker priors, like ballot measures or primaries, for which you can't say, well, I'm going to vote for the Democrat or the Republican, then the campaigns have a bit more room for influence. I mean, the effects remain really weak, but they exist. We also know that there are sometimes large enough effects of politicians' opinions on their followers, but only for what political scientists call non-attitudes. So if you're a big Bernie Sanders fan, and that Bernie Sanders take a position on such and such trade treaty that you've never heard about, then you are likely to agree with him. But if he takes a position on something that you care about and you're knowledgeable about, then if he disagrees with you, you're going to like him less instead of changing your mind. And so broadly, the overwhelming majority of the influence is bottom-up. It's people exert a very strong influence on politicians, and politicians are constantly querying public opinion. They're looking at polls, they're doing focus groups, in order to make sure that they say and to some extent do things that would be well received by public opinion. And so the last example of mass persuasion attempts I will look at is by far the most massive in scale, at least in kind of financial scale nowadays. I think maybe in 2020, something like $500 billion, so $500 billion were spent in the world on advertising. And so given the amounts at stake, you would think that the efficacy of advertising would be something that has been well studied. But in fact, it's quite hard to figure out how efficient advertising is. And it's only quite recently that researchers have conducted some really kind of rigorous, serious studies of that. And I will just give you one example of a paper, arguably the best paper on the efficacy of TV advertising. And like all of these papers, all of that literature, what they look at is the elasticity of advertising. So what that means is that if you have an ad campaign and you increase the amount of advertising, so you double your budget, or you double the prints, or you double the amount of TV ads in that case, how much are sales going to increase by? And so if your sales increase by the same amount, so if you double your advertising budget and then your sales double, then your elasticity is 1. If you double your advertising budget, but your sales only increase by 50%, then your elasticity is 0.5, et cetera, et cetera. And so in that paper by Brad Shapiro and his colleagues, what they show is that, so they looked at really kind of clever natural experiments, looking at hundreds and hundreds of TV campaigns, TV ad campaigns, and their results reveal a sizable percentage of statistically insignificant or negative estimates. So again, most campaigns either don't work or have negative effects. Very few have large positive effects. And the average elasticity was 0.01. So on average, if you double your advertising budget, you're going to increase your sales by 1%, which might be enough to justify to have a positive return on investment, but these are very, 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 very small effects. And broadly, this is the conclusion of the literature on advertising, also on online ads, that the effects of advertising are, as a rule, small or non-existent. And so, for instance, you could find already 20 years ago in a book by one of the kind of gurus of advertising research, Gerard Tellis, that the truth, as many advertisers will quickly admit, is that persuasion is very tough. So, actually, once when you're in a business, how hard it is to convince people. So mass persuasion tends to persuade nearly no one. It doesn't mean it doesn't have other effects, but in terms of sheer persuasion, like making people change their minds, this is tremendously difficult. The only messages that really resonate with people's priors are accepted. So indeed, if you tell people that such and such ethnic group is bad and they already believed it, then they will accept your message, but it's not going to change their mind. They accept it because they already believed it. And it's only when some trust has been earned that you can exert some influence, and typically only at the margin. So again, for instance, the case of the politician who manages to get his followers to change their minds on something that really they don't care about all that much. So why? I mean, it's quite, I think, well established in every field that has looked at the question that mass persuasion attempts are extremely difficult, and in a way it's been known since like the first half of the 20th century when sociologists and political scientists started looking at the question, so it's hardly novel. But the question I will turn to is now is why? Why is it so hard to persuade a lot of people quickly and at once, quickly? And I think it's because human beings are endowed with a huge a set of cognitive mechanisms that I've called in the book mentioned earlier, mechanisms of open vigilance, but are the same as mechanisms that Dan Sperber and a number of us had called mechanisms of epistemic vigilance earlier. The idea being that these are mechanisms in your head whose function is to make sure that most of the information you accept is reliable and beneficial to you. And so here is how I think, and kind of the evidence suggests that these mechanisms work. So when you are communicated something, when you're told something, when you read something, the first thing you will do is to check the plausibility of the content given your priors. So essentially, you check whether it makes sense given what you believe to be true about the world, whether what you're told makes sense or not. So for instance, if Joan tells you you should buy this phone, How you treat that information will depend on the phone it is, that and on what you believe about it. So if you hate everything Apple, and if she's recommending that you buy an iPhone, your intuitive reaction will be to reject the advice. So that's kind of the default. Whenever we encounter a piece of communicated information that doesn't fit with our priors, we tend to instinctively reject it. Fortunately, we are able, because sometimes the other people is right and we're wrong. And so fortunately, we are able to overcome this default reaction. And to do this, we pay attention to a number of cues that can lead us to accept communicated information, even when it clashes with our priors. So one of the cues we will look at is the source well informed? So is Joan, for instance, someone who knows a lot about smartphones? Or is Joan someone who has experience with kind of this smartphone in particular? Is the source competent? So is Joan someone who is really kind of an expert in the relevant domain? Does the source have your interest at heart? So is Joan, a friend of yours, or is she a salesperson in an Apple store? Are many people agreeing? Like if all of your friends recommend a given item, a given smartphone, for instance, to you, it's actually a pretty good argument for that likely it's likely a good piece of advice. And are there good arguments? Is Joan able to tell you why that is a good phone? The battery life, the camera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, unsurprisingly, many experiments in psychology have shown that adults are well able to take all of these cues into account and to combine them in different ways when they evaluate communicated information. What's maybe more surprising is that for about 20 years now, developmental psychologists have conducted a large number of experiments on very small children, including kind of infants, 1- 2-year-olds, testing whether these small kids are able to take these cues into account. So for instance, does a typical toddler tend to prefer information from someone who is competent than from someone who is incompetent, or from someone who shares their interest compared to someone who doesn't share their interest? And so what the evidence so far shows is that by the preschool years, so for kind of kindergartner, from 4 to 6, already children are well able to take all of these cues into account. And there's some evidence that even infants can take some, they're more likely to accept the testimony or of someone who is an expert in the relevant area than someone who is not, or someone who has their interests at heart. So the missing tick marks are things that haven't been shown yet. We can't know for a fact that younger kids are unable to take them into account, but it just hasn't been shown. But it's maybe they can. But clearly these are very, very early developing capabilities. And I don't know how well you remember what a toddler looks like, but for instance, they can't count to 2. So it's quite amazing that in spite of otherwise kind of stringent limitations on their cognitive abilities, they're actually pretty good already at discriminating different types of communicated information. So we have a number of cues that allow us to evaluate information, and sometimes to overcome our default reaction of rejection towards any information that clashes with our priors. And on the whole, what the literature suggests is that when we have all of that information, so when you know whether someone is well informed or not, when you know whether they're an expert in the relevant area, when you know whether their interests align with yours or not, when you have time to exchange arguments at length, then people do change their minds. People do, when they're wrong, they accept better information, and accurate information spreads really well. By contrast, when these cues are absent, what is going to happen? When essentially, if you consider a typical campaign, TV ad, you don't know who is telling you this. You don't really know if they are, a real doctor or something, for instance. You know that you have a conflict of interest. You know that they are trying to sell you something. You don't know how many people actually agree that that product is good. They don't have time to exchange arguments with you. So typically in any attempt at mass persuasion, at convincing a lot of people at once, none of these cues are going to be available. And so what that means is that in the absence of these cues, people resort to a sort of kind of rational skepticism in which they reject any information that doesn't fit with their priors. And that's why mass persuasion is so hard, because typically you don't have time to exchange arguments, you don't really have time to build trust with people. And so if you don't tell them something that they already agree with, they will tend to reject it. So that's true as a rule, but clearly you can think of exceptions, and sometimes people end up having false beliefs. I think it's actually very rare that a lot of people end up having false beliefs through mass persuasion. Usually it's other mechanisms that are at play. But people, clearly people are mistaken about a lot of things. And so the point I want to turn to now is how bad is that? How problematic is it that people believe, conspiracy theories and fake news and all these sort of things? And so that's the last point. Is it the case that believing absurdities make us commit atrocities, as Voltaire and really his translator put it? And I will argue that this is mostly not the case, that mostly the causality is reversed, and that what primes is people's behavior, and that once people are motivated to engage in a given behavior, they will make stuff up to justify it. But something that is really important in the argument I'm going to make is that I believe that most of these false beliefs that are culturally acquired, like fake news and conspiracy theories and false rumors and this sort of things, they are held reflectively. And that's a contrast that Dan Sperber drew between intuitive and reflective beliefs that I will just illustrate with an example. So most of you, I guess, will remember the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that was flourishing during the Trump versus Clinton political presidential campaign. And according to this conspiracy theory, high-ranking Democrats were kind of abusing, sexually abusing and torturing children in the basement of among other places, the basement of a pizzeria in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Like this Comet Ping Pong pizzeria there. And if you look at polls at the time, it seems as if more than half of Trump voters, and nearly half of Trump voters, and even a small fraction of Clinton voters, thought that there was something true about this. They thought that there was something true about, emails leaked talking about pedophilia and human trafficking, what has been then referred to as Pizzagate, because it was supposed to take place in the pizzeria. And so if you look at these numbers, that is extremely worrying, because you have dozens of millions of Americans believing something that is completely, utterly absurd. And one of the reasons why that specific conspiracy theory became so infamous is that this young man, Edgar Madison Welsh, decided to take his machine gun and his truck, and he drove from, I believe, West Virginia, I'm not sure, to the Comet Ping Pong pizzeria, and he tried to free the children. He tried to deliver the children who are being supposedly held in that pizzeria. He even fired a few shots in the ceiling to scare people off. But because there were no children, there was not even a basement to hide the children in. He was arrested, and then he spent a number of years in jail. But in a way, this example illustrates maybe what it means to have an intuitive belief. So this guy presumably believed that the children were being held and being abused as if he had seen them, for instance, or as if he had close friend of his tell him that that was the case. And by this light, his reaction is actually quite rational and moral. Like, imagine, thinking that there are children being tortured somewhere not very far from you, and that the police is too corrupt to do anything about it, and you happen to have a gun. It seems as if trying to free them is the rational and the right thing to do. Like, it's actually quite coherent with your beliefs to try to do that. By contrast, so there's just kind of one guy, by contrast to the dozens of people who said that they believed in something like this. And by contrast, there are most people reacting in a way that was really different. And they, for instance, they left one-star reviews of the pizzeria on various websites like Google. So for instance, this guy said he left a one-star review, and he said that the pizza was incredibly undercooked, that suspicious professionally dressed men by the bar area that looked like regulars kept staring at my son and other kids in the place, definitely not coming back, beginning to think the conspiracy about this place are true. And if you looked at the time, and I think they've been kind of expunged since, but at the time there are kind of dozens and dozens and hundreds of such reviews on that poor restaurant's website. And that was the basic reaction of most people who believed in this theory. And that's what we can call a reflective belief, in the sense that it might have been genuinely held. Like people might have said, no, I believe that this is true, that people are being abused. And yet the gap, there's a massive gap between the behavior and the belief, in the sense that if you actually believe that children are being abused in that restaurant, it is completely incongruous to leave a 1-star review that starts with the fact that the pizza is undercooked and only then moves on to the pedophilia. And obviously to bring your kids to a place in which you suspect that pedophilia is going on is, just, don't do that. So you can see the difference between people, one person who kind of intuitively believed that the theories was true and acted on it, and the overwhelming, like the 99.999% of the people who believed in it reflectively and who either did nothing about it, or if they did something that was really, really kind of bizarre. And the contrast, another way of really of illustrating that contrast, is to think of conspiracy theories. So people, when we think about conspiracy theorists, many of them are really vocal. They're going to have blogs and YouTube channels, and they're going to say, oh, but the CIA orchestrated 9/11, and Sandy Hook was a false flag operation. So, and that's really bizarre when you think about it, because if you really believe that the CIA is powerful and evil enough to pull something like 9/11, then clearly they're going to kill you. If you point it out, why not kill you? And indeed, if you look at the behavior of people who live in countries in which the secret services are really, really bad, like the internal intelligence services are really bad, like Pakistan, for instance, these people don't shout from the rooftops that the ISI is killing people, because they actually are killing people, and they're going to kill you if you say it. By contrast, if you look at the behavior of people who intuitively believe in conspiracy theories, so typically whistleblowers, people who have witnessed something going on in their company, in their government, in their organization, these people are really afraid of speaking up. They're afraid for their jobs, sometimes for their lives. They tend not to talk about it. It's really hard to get them to talk about it. And so you have this really kind of very strong contrast between people who have actually witnessed a conspiracy and who know there is a conspiracy, who tend to be really, really hard to get to talk, and people who believe in conspiracy theories who talk about it endlessly in a way that's not coherent at all with the beliefs that they're describing. There was also, as a side note, there was also a nice study that showed that in the I guess it was the Obama versus Romney campaign, there was a lot, and then the Obama-Trump campaign, there was a massive rumor circulating according to which Obama was a Muslim. And a nice study showed that, unsurprisingly, people who already did not like Obama were much more likely to accept that rumor. But maybe more surprisingly, accepting the rumor did not make people like Obama less. So then again, people who already believe something, they would accept things that are coherent with it. But because they already believe, the important conclusion, it doesn't really affect the outcome. And so one way of saying that a belief is held can reflectively, and then again, I'm not saying that people don't genuinely hold these beliefs, they might be very confident, but it's essentially, it's stuck in a part of their mind and of their brain, and it doesn't really interact with their behavior or with other beliefs. So one way of kind of diagnosing that is that you have the belief, but you don't really behave as if you had the belief. And another way is if you can tell that the belief is mostly used to justify your behavior instead of actually causing the behavior. So I'll illustrate this with one of my kind of favorite study I ever did, I think, which is about bloodletting. So for 2 millennia, Western medicine was dominated by the Galenic and the humoral theory of disease, according to which health and disease is mostly determined by the balance between 4 humors. So there's blood, there's phlegm, there's 2 others that I don't remember. And as a result of that, the best way of treating most diseases is to do bloodletting. So people have too much blood, and so you want to let a bit of blood flow. Typically, as you might remember, people would be cut from their forearm, and you let a little bit of blood flow, and that is supposed to cure or to prevent just about any illness. And that was true up until the late 18th and then the mid-19th century. And so, for instance, when George Washington was taken ill with a throat infection in the winter of 1799, I think, as you can imagine, the best doctors of the day were called to his bedside. It was practically a god in the US. So the best doctors of the day are called to his bedside. And over the course of the next few days, they proceed to bleed him of about 2.5 liters of blood, which is about half the blood that a typical human adult has. And as you can imagine, rather unsurprisingly, George Washington passed away. So there it seems as if we have an example of people accepting a false belief. In that case, the humoral theory of disease, elaborated by the Hippocratic writers and then Galen. And then because they accept that false belief about how human health works, they have these very, very costly actions, like essentially killing George Washington. Another thing people used to do is, for instance, Benjamin Rush, another of the founders of the US Constitution. He was maybe the most famous doctor in America in the day. And when there are epidemics, like there was at some point an epidemic of yellow fever in Philadelphia, you would take all the sick people and you would put them in the same room, and then you would bleed them all a little bit, but with the same scalpel, without washing the scalpel, because the germ theory of disease had not been invented yet. So all of that, kind of not very good ideas. So then again, it seems as if you have that causality between having a mistaken belief about how health works and having these really costly, dramatic consequences. But in fact, when you look at the anthropological literature, it's very clear that this is not at all what happens. Because it turns out that something like between the third and maybe a half of the cultures in the world practice bloodletting. So these are all the cultures from the human relation area files in which it's been shown that people practice or used to practice bloodletting. And obviously, essentially, none of them have ever heard of Galen or the Hippocratic writers or the humoral theory of disease, which shows that instead of which shows that essentially the idea that drawing a bit of blood can cure an ailment is a very intuitive practice for reasons I'm happy to go into in the Q&A. That a lot of cultures are going to land on and are going to keep practicing for millennia without usually theorizing why it's a good idea to do so. And that it's only if you have a very sophisticated culture like ancient Greece or ancient Rome, in which people want to have justification for their beliefs and for the therapies that they recommend, that people are going to start developing a whole theoretical system to justify this intuitive practice. And that once you have this whole theoretical system in place, the influence it has on the practice itself is fairly modest. So it can influence, where you draw blood from or how much blood is going to be drawn. But the very practice itself is not due to the theory. It's really the other way around. And another striking example, and kind of pretty current, is resistance to vaccination. So many people believe that resistance to vaccination is caused by false ideas that spread very quickly, that vaccination causes autism or a whole lot of other issues. But in fact, if you look at all across the world, so each of these graphs is a different country, and this is the share of people who believe that vaccines are safe across different points in time. The green lines are people who mostly agree that vaccines are safe. Sorry, people who strongly agree that vaccines are safe. The blue line are people who are kind of in between, and the red line are people who strongly disagree that vaccines are safe. So these are the kind of strong kind of anti-vax people. And you can see, first of all, that in every country, essentially, there is a small, 1, 2, 3, 5% of people who strongly believe that vaccination is bad. That share is essentially not evolving. It's very high in France, which is very sad. It's like the highest country in the world, I think. But it's essentially not changing. It's been there. And if you look across history, back when inoculation was introduced in the UK in the mid-19th century, a lot of people were already opposed to it. So everywhere in the world, there are some people who do not like vaccination and who are going to be quite vocal about it. But what's interesting is that the reasons they give to reject vaccination vary widely all across the world. So that's just like a very small sample. The shaken baby syndrome is a vaccine injury, that HPV leads to headaches and seizures in Japan, that the UNICEF, in East Africa, that UNICEF and the WHO, the WHO, are sterilizing the population against the tetanus vaccine. you start using the tetanus vaccine. You have like the Zika vaccine causes microcephaly. So essentially in every culture, every cultural group, you'll have a different belief for why vaccination is bad. But the fact that you have this common ground of rejection of vaccination everywhere, but that the beliefs vary widely, suggests that this intuition we have, or not everybody, but the intuition that some people have that vaccination is a bad idea is the prime mover. And then people are going to hatch on any kind of culturally available excuse to justify the rejection of vaccination. So to conclude, we are not gullible. On the contrary, we are endowed with quite efficient cognitive mechanisms of open vigilance that allow us to evaluate communicated information. These mechanisms are going to look at whether communicated information matches with our beliefs or not. And it's also going to look at a series of cues, such as is the source well informed, et cetera, to inform our decision to accept or to reject any piece of communicated information. And on the whole, that works well, that works really well for information that is personally relevant. So when you talk to your colleagues about advice at work, when you talk to your family members, anything that kind of matters to you, and when you're talking to people that you know well, and you have time to talk to them at length, then people change their mind and good information spreads quite well. By contrast, when we do not have these cues, when you don't know how trustworthy the person is, when you don't know how much of an expert they are, then we take this stance of kind of rational skepticism in which we tend to reject anything that doesn't fit with our priors. And this is why, by and large, kind of as a persuasion attempt, most persuasion really fails to persuade just about anybody. Clearly, undeniably, some false beliefs spread, like false beliefs about vaccines, about conspiracy theories, about anything. Some of these spread. It's rare that they spread to mass persuasion. Usually, it's more kind of word of mouth, or kind of this kind of slower type of spread, but it does spread sometimes. But these false beliefs that are culturally acquired, they tend to be reflective. And so people believe in them genuinely, but it's still kind of isolated in their minds, and it doesn't really have a lot of effects and impacts on their other thoughts and behaviors. And oftentimes, these beliefs actually have some beneficial for the individuals who hold them social functions, such as justifying an intuitive practice. Thank you.